As a longtime friend and colleague from the Aga Khan program, where we were both students, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Nasser Rabbat today. Well, this is he's, as many of you know, the Aga Khan professor and director of the Aga Khan program of Islamic architecture at MIT. In his second lecture, I was asked to give a more art historical and architectural historical introduction because Professor Granara has already introduced him, but since not all of you were there, I think I will take some time. So he's now delivering the second in our prestigious H.A.R. Gibb Arabic and Islamic Studies lecture series. And the previous lecture was on comparing Ibn Khaldun and his student Makrizi's writings in general on cities, but more specifically on Cairo. More generally, Professor Rabbat is an internationally renowned architect and architectural historian who contributes to also a number of Arabic newspapers on current political and cultural issues, serving on the boards of several cultural and educational organizations, as well as consulting with international design firms, especially in his later years on many building projects advising. In addition to being at the forefront of Mamluk studies, he has been a pioneer in post-colonial criticism and also a public intellectual deeply concerned with the current predicaments of the Arab Middle East. Accordingly, I would group his many publications in terms of sort of two areas that are both complementary as well as with different methods, namely his publications on the pre-modern Mamluk and Islamic art and architecture on one hand, and secondly, critical approaches to more modern and contemporary, both art historiography, architectural practice, and the politics of the built environment. So an example of the later approach is his most recent book titled The Destruction of Cultural Heritage from Napoleon to ISIS, co-edited with Pamela Karimi and published online in 2016. Another related book in Arabic is titled Criticism as Commitment, Viewpoints on History, Arabism, and Revolution, published in Beirut in 2015, which deals with the roots as well as consequences of the Arab Spring, which I remember we had drinks together when that was announced. Professor Rabbat's renowned books on the Mamluks include Mamluk History Through Architecture, Building Culture and Politics in Mamluk Egypt and Syria, that was not only published in London in 2010, but also won the British Kuwait Friendship Society Prize in Middle East Studies. I also must mention his first book that has become a classic, The Citadel of Cairo, a new interpretation of Royal Mamluk architecture, published in Leiden in 1995. He has also co-edited Making Cairo Medieval, 2005, and edited The Courtyard House Between Cultural Reference and Universal Relevance in London, 2010, which was an MIT Aga Khan program's conference results. The same year, he published an Arabic book on the dead cities, Lessons from its History and Views on its Future, which is currently revising and finishing as a second edition in light of the massive looting and destruction of heritage sites in Syria and Iraq. Now I invite Professor Rabbat Nasser to the podium. As he pointed out in the last lecture, this one titled Designing Transcendence, Light in Islamic Architecture will be more visually oriented and accompanied by slides.
Thank you. When I was a starting scholar, I gave my first presentation in an art historical conference, and I had no slides. And somebody commented that if you continue that way, you will never get a tenure position anywhere. So that's why I'm actually going back to my roots today. I'm going to show some slides. Otherwise, I usually would like words to do the imaging. This is really an attempt at showing you how beautiful Islamic architecture is. So there is no hidden agenda behind the talk today. And if it comes across as a bit too spiritual, which is, for those of you who know me, is such an anomaly for me, it's simply because the material itself somehow asks for that kind of interpretation. So we'll start. Arabic, the language of the Quran, is a rich, lyrical, and expansive language, replete with cognates and almost synonymous terms expressing subtle gradations of general meaning or various connotations stemming from that same overall meaning. The gradation is sometime in the scale, range, or intensity of a quality or of an attribute. Sometimes it is an ontological transformation from, say, an earthly, material, or physical form to an immaterial, conceptual, or spiritual one. This is the case with the words for light. There are at least 2 words denoting it and many others that capture one or more of its qualities. The first is daw, and the second is nur, a more extensive term with a broader range of meaning than daw and deeper. Moreover, nur contains the connotation of emanation, the view of light as self-generating, which of course is a quality reserved for the transcendent, the otherworldly, or the divine, and a quality to which art usually aspires. This is indeed the underlying significance of the most widely quoted verse on light in the Quran, Ayat an-Nur, or the verse of light, which I will read first in Arabic for you to appreciate its rhymic cadences. Allahu nuru samawati wal ard, مثل نوره كمشكاة فيها مصباح المصباح في زجاجة الزجاجة كأنها كوكب دري يوقد من شجرة مباركة زيتونة لا شرقية ولا غربية يكاد زيتها يضيء ولو لم تمسسه نار نور على نور يهدي الله لنوره من يشاء ويضرب الله الأمثال للناس والله بكل شيء عليم. And here is one of its best English translations. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. The parable of his light is a niche, wherein is a lamp. The lamp is in a glass. The glass, as it were, a glittering star, lit from a blessed olive tree, neither eastern nor western, whose oil almost lights up, though fire should not touch it. Light upon light. God guides to his light whomever he wishes. God draws parables for mankind, and God has knowledge of all things. The image is quite moving, but also familiar. God is light is an old metaphor that existed in numerous ancient religions all over the world, but found its fullest expression in the 3 religions that insisted on the oneness of God: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Judaism has God creating light in Genesis. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. Judaism then endows one of its most important symbols, the menorah of the 7 lamps described in Exodus 25, with the ideal of universal enlightenment. Notice that the word menorah shares the central syllable or root with the Arabic nur. In fact, the form menorah with M before the root and AH or ta' marbuta in Arabic at the very end indicates that the term designates an object for light, just like the term minara or minaret for the mosque tower in Arabic, which means a light tower. And just like the descriptive adjective munawwara, added usually to the name of the city of the Prophet Muhammad in today's Saudi Arabia, Al-Madina al-Munawwara, or the city bathed in divine light because the Prophet is buried there. Christianity, too, has its light symbolism, which is more overtly associated with Jesus Christ than the rather subordinate connection between God and light in Judaism. John the Apostle, in his gospel, emphatically identifies Jesus Christ with light. He opens his gospel with the words, "In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in darkness, and the darkness can never put it out." He then adds, "As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Or, again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." This, of course, has motivated artists throughout the years to represent Jesus as light, or surrounded by light, or with light emanating from him, all qualities associated with his divine nature. Islam continued and magnified this theme. Indeed, the light verse is only the most explicit, even if the most enigmatic association of God with light in Islam. As such, it has been the inspiration behind countless metaphysical readings by philosophers, theologians, and of course, Sufis throughout Islamic history. It has also inspired many artistic interpretations, ranging from the explicit to the sublime. A few artists even tried to figuratively represent the eminent light that is the essence of divinity, while acknowledging the impossibility of that representation for a religion that repeatedly and categorically bans any depiction of God. Thus, when in 1436 the Timurid atelier of Herat in Afghanistan had to imagine the culmination of the Prophet Muhammad's ascension or Mi'raj to the presence of the divine in Sadarat al-Muntaha, they came up with an ingenious depiction. They depicted the Prophet prostrating in complete surrender, the actual meaning of the term Islam, in a field of sinuous golden flames showing strong Chinese influence in front of the unseen and unseeable God, save for his nur, for his light. All traces of dimensions, proportionality, or finite space have been erased. No foreground, no background, no horizon, no plan to stand on, no shadow, only the emanation of the light of God, filling the entire field of vision. Other artists, however, went for a more literal depiction of the mysterious verse of light. Many actually wrote it down, or more precisely, calligraphied it, as calligraphy rose to become the most advanced and respected art form in the Islamic world. They did this on paper and on objects, especially, of course, on mosque lamps, as the most appropriate carrier of the mystery of light. On this beautiful Mamluk enameled and gilded glass mosque lamp made for Sultan Barquq, who ruled Egypt and Syria between 1382 and 1399, the verse of light is written in blue crowded Naskhi style around the flaring conical mouth. So this is the verse of light. And you can see how crowded the words are to fit all in that rim, and is interspersed twice by rondelle containing the blason of the Sultan in the usual manner of the Mamluks. Hundreds, if not thousands, of similar lamps used to hang low from the ceilings of mosques, creating atmospheric light zones on the prayer surface, as in this recreation in the Muhammad Ali Pasha Mosque in Cairo, a 19th century mosque, where electricity nonetheless presents an overwhelming substitute of the flickering and dancing flames of the oil lamps of yesteryears. The light verse was also frequently inscribed on buildings, primarily on the rim of domes, such as in the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, or on the circumference of their oculus, as in the dome of the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul as well, combining as such the symbolism of the dome as the dome of heaven, an association inherited from classical and Christian predecessors, with the verse that signifies the presence of the throne of God atop the seventh heaven. Built originally between 532 and 537 under Emperor Justinian to be the main imperial church in Constantinople, Hagia Sophia became a mosque after the conquest of the city by Sultan Mehmed II in 1453, when Constantinople became Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire for the next 5 centuries. The dome, along with the rest of the church, was Islamized with the inscription of the verse of light. The beautiful thuluth writing that we see in here in the verse itself is actually an early 19th century addition. But the 4 6-winged seraphs added by Basil II in 994, whose faces were painted over after the Ottoman conquest, except for one that was uncovered, the one here on the lower left, you can see the face, powerfully reinforced the complementarity of iconography between the Byzantine figurative and the Islamic textual traditions, where the light of God of the Quranic verse sits atop the dome of heaven, which is literally supported by the seraphim, who in Christian medieval theology carried the throne of God. Light, in fact, infuses Hagia Sophia's spaces with ethereal incandescence. It penetrates its cavernous and dark interior in bright shafts at different angles and from different points, following the hours of the day and the days of the year, and reflects everywhere, especially of the gilded Byzantine mosaic surfaces or the Arabic inscription rondelles around the 4 corners of the dome. It also bathes the space of the nave with a dim glow, giving the shallow dome the appearance of hovering above the ground. This magical effect is achieved by the 40 deeply cut arched windows around the base of the dome, in addition to the myriad windows in the tympana, half domes, and apses. The variation in luminosity is enhanced by the different colors and textures of the interior, ranging from dark and polished marble, porphyry, and basalt columns below, to gilded mosaics and glowing yellow stuccoed pendentives and domical surfaces above. Ottoman classical mosques, for which the Hagia Sophia was both a model and a challenge, had a different approach to light. Though all of them are of the central dome type, with a combination of tympana and or half domes for support, they are all suffused in bright daylight. This is both a theological and an aesthetic preference, and it was made possible by structural innovation, for which most of the credit goes to Mimar Sinan, who lived between 1490 and 1588, the most famous of all Islamic architects. Sinan, who is reported to have built more than 70 mosques, has thought throughout his long career to surpass the Hagia Sophia's dome. He achieved that in his last masterpiece, the Selimiye Imperial Mosque in Edirne, built between 1569 and 1574, through the dynamic manipulation of support systems and the logical transfer of load via buttresses, tympana, and cascading domical counterweights. This freed the membranes of the mosque from being load-bearing and allowed Sinan to pierce them with large number of windows, a gesture that filled the interior space with natural light, serving the taste and theological convictions of his patrons and co-religionists. Theologically, the Ottomans were Sunni Muslims who followed the Hanafi, tolerant theological and jurisprudential school. To them, as well as to the majority of Muslims, the mosque is not a sacred space per se, except for the three mosques of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. The mosque is essentially a social space, the place where men pray together, to use Paul Wheatley's felicitous expression. As such, classical Ottoman architects were striving to create open, unified, and flowing interior spaces with unhindered views and balanced lighting, even if they occasionally added a touch of glimmering transcendence. Aesthetically, the Ottomans seem to have favored well-lit interiors. Their favorite decoration of the important spots inside the mosque was tiles with bright colors and mostly white background, with light marble supports and white surfaces. This lent the space a feeling of lightness and expansiveness, which was echoed in the care Ottoman architects took to conceal the massive pillars supporting the huge central dome in an intricate arrangement of arcades, balconies, and wall thicknesses. The masterful use of colored tiles for shimmering effects, however, was the domain of the Safavids, the Ottoman arch-rivals and Shiite rulers of Iran in the 16th and 17th century. All of their monuments were tiled inside and out, but the masterpiece is undoubtedly the Mosque of Sheikh Lutfallah, a small domical structure nestled along the long row of arch shops forming a side of the Great Maidan in Isfahan. Built between 1603 and 1618 by Shah Abbas I as part of his large urban plan for his capital, this private mosque represents the highest refinement of mosaic tiling, called haftaranji, literally 7-colored tiles, and using both glazed and unglazed tiles in intricate polychromatic patterns. Color and composition combine to dazzle the viewer, from the Muqarnas arched portal to the sun-patterned golden dome interior with its descending and rippling ribbons of lozenge shapes medallions containing floral patterns. The transition from blue and green tiles of the mosque cube to gold on its dome inside and outside alludes to the natural order from earth and sea to radiating sun, and may also involve esoteric readings derived from Shiite cosmology, the official creed of the empire. Earlier mosques, which all followed the hypostyle type, display a rather different understanding of the effect of light on interior spaces. The famous Cordoba Mezquita, for instance, maintained the rhythm of parallel arcades through 4 Islamic enlargement between 784 and 987, and the later insertion of a Gothic cathedral into its fabric in the 16th century. Its interior, a forest of columns, each surmounted by 2 superimposed arches with voussoirs stripped in alternating red and white, seems unending, with its geometry repeated in every direction. But the maqsura, or the royal enclosure, with its multifoil interlacing arches, and the chamber mihrab at the end of the central aisle, create a focal point through extravagant detailing and manipulation of the light descending from the windows, encircling the three-ribbed domes covering the Maqsura. This was so beautifully depicted by the French illustrator Giraud de Prangui in 1833, long before modern artificial lighting altered the original scheme with highlights of various points of importance inside the space. Another type of structural invention, this one purely Islamic, introduced a totally novel and quite enigmatic light effect. This was the Muqarnas, which made its first appearance in Central Asia around the middle of the 10th century before spreading across the rest of the Islamic world. It started as a structural invention. Architects of the Eastern or Persianate part of the Islamic world who had used squinches as the transition or as a transitional element from cube to dome for centuries realized that they can subdivide the squinch into wedges, individually and collectively called Muqarnas. So what I'm talking about is this, is the division of an arch squinch into two wedges in here, which you could imagine could be subdivided over and over and over. Their early experiments in buildings, like this Samanid mausoleum in Bukhara, which date to the early 10th century, were structurally driven, but they opened the door for new and dazzling decorative possibilities. They were followed by more formally elegant solutions of subdivisions as the new invention traveled west to Iran, where the Seljukid vizier Taj al-Mulk built his superb northern dome next to the congregational mosque of Isfahan, the Masjid-i-Jomeh, in 1088. This mysterious and geometrically perfect structure, which translate load trajectories into pronounced architectural elements from the pentagonal star formation of interlacing transverse ribs in the dome, where we can see them in here on top, to the pointed trefoil Muqarnas squinches and down to the slender brick columns, has puzzled researchers. It was even considered for some time to be the distant inspiration behind the emergence of the structurally revolutionary Gothic construction system in Europe in the 12th century. The next stage in the development of Muqarnas saw the rise of the Muqarnas dome, a visually extravagant concoction that combined the structural property of the Muqarnas with its capacity to form intricate domical crystal series that have been likened to honeycombs and stalactites. And in fact, for a very long time, Muqarnas in European literature was called honeycomb or stalactite. An early experiment is this dome of Imam Dur in Samarra, dated to 1085, where 5 concentric rings of Muqarnas squinches end with a small cupola, resulting in a pointed conical profile on the outside and a stunning cascade of gradually lit cusped stars on the inside. This was successively followed by more daring Muqarnas domes in Iraq and Syria throughout the 12th and 13th century, such as the mausoleum of Nur ad-Din ibn Zingi in Damascus, with its 5 tiers of Muqarnas dated to 1167, and the Zumurrud Khatun's tomb in Baghdad, with 7 tiers built by this powerful wife of a caliph and a mother of another caliph around 1200. These domes used the Muqarnas both as an integral structural element of a tiered conical vault and a constituent of a new decorative pattern with infinite geometric variations. And although we do not know for sure what these intricate structures signified, Yasser Tabbah has imaginatively read them as spatial renderings of the atomistic theory of the Ash'ari theological school that became dominant in the same period. The Ash'aris see the world as a constellation of an infinite variety of shapes, not very different from Plato in this sense, constantly changing and kept in place only by the will of God. Using Muqarnas domes may indeed have been meant as a visual reminder of the miracle of being, an ascending composition with all of its sophisticated elements suspended as if floating on a bed of light. The Muqarnas dome type persisted for many centuries, but its structural functionality was discarded by the 14th century in favor of its dazzling ornamental potential. The apogee of the type was in the famous Palace of the Lions in the Alhambra in Granada. Two halls, named today the Hall of the Two Sisters and the Hall of the Abencerrages. These are not their original names. They are due to an American author with a very fertile imagination, Irvin Washington, for those of you who have read him. These two halls have the most stunning decorative Muqarnas domes of all times. Shaped as cascading 8-pointed stars, these domes display multifarious arrangements of Muqarnas to achieve an overwhelming visual effect of shimmering and shifting points of lights inscribed within recognizable geometrical pattern. A soliloquist poem by the Andalusian poet Ibn Zamrak, who lived between 1333 and 1393, and who was the boon companion of Sultan Muhammad V, the builder of the palace, is inscribed on the walls of the Hall of the Two Sisters. It may give us an idea of how contemporaries understood the decoration of these domes. And I'll read you just a short passage of the poem. In it, that is the hall, is a splendid dome that has no equal. Its beauty is both hidden and manifest. Gemini extends to it a greeting hand, and the moon comes down closer to chat with her at night. The glowing stars wish to be fixed there and not run around in the celestial wheel. This cosmic reading of the dome is apt, for the universal understanding of the dome as symbol of the heavenly vault is highlighted by the multitude of Muqarnas star patterns. The night theme of the poem, moreover, alerts us to the more common use of the hall as a setting for the Sultan's night gatherings. Imagining the flickering of the oil lamps or candlelight refracted on the countless curved surfaces of the Muqarnas dome emphatically recalls the night sky, the preferred poetic cover for all the pleasurable and mysterious nocturnal activities. More explicit allusions to royal pleasures appear on a unique Muqarnas hall, the banquet hall of the famous Safavid Shah Abbas, popularly known as the music room, and built around 1600. Located on the 6th floor of the impressive structure named the Ali Qapu, or the lofty gate, which you see on top, the main room, a private pleasure hall surrounded by 6 smaller halls similarly decorated, has 4 deep-cut Muqarnas niches surrounding a square space surmounted by a flat Muqarnas dome. The Muqarnases of the niches all contain elaborate cutout plasterwork depicting all shapes of vessels and some music instruments. You can imagine what that means. The Muqarnases of the dome are painted with floral and geometric arabesques. The overall effect of all the cutouts is both visual and acoustic, creating an intimate space with low reverberations for music, conversation, and drinking settings. One of the last Muqarnas domes was also built in Isfahan's royal enclosure, to which the Ali Qapu served as a gate. This is the Hasht Behisht, or the 8th Paradise Pavilion, constructed in 1669, a square building with a central domed hall surrounded by 4 two-story wings and 4 large open porches. The dome of the central hall was reflected in a large octagonal pool, and its Muqarnases arranged in 5 tiers of rings supporting a large lantern were once covered with small mirrors, creating a wonderful light reverberation between the pool and the dome, and the natural light coming from the open porches below and the lantern above. Another Islamic architectural tradition that was intimately associated with light is the lattice work. which developed to tremendous sophistication, reaching its apogee in Mughal India. Its earliest examples come from the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, built between 705 and 715, and displaying strong affinities with the Byzantine and classical traditions in Syria. So this is the Umayyad Mosque screen that I'm talking about. The marble carved windows in Damascus with their straightforward geometric patterns were succeeded by similar windows but with stucco grills when the center of gravity of Islamic art moved with the rise of the Abbasid from Syria to Iraq and further east with their brick building tradition and Persian influences, such as these two windows in here from the Mosque of Ibn Tulun in Al-Qataya, which was later on absorbed in Cairo, built in 876-79 in the Abbasid Samarran style. But the later encounter with the much more developed carving traditions of India boosted the refinement of lattice work commissioned for Islamic buildings, especially in the tombs and shrines. Filtering the light through these carved screens called jali in India confers an atmosphere of both melancholy and mystery on the interior of the tombs, two qualities that very much enhance the enigma of death and the mercy of God afforded his select servants. The technical agility of the Indian carvers allowed the designers to explore patterns beyond the straightforwardly geometric patterns and of yesteryears. One example is the combination of geometric patterns and sinuous floral motifs in the wooden screens of the mausoleum of Shah Rukni Alam in Multan in Pakistan, built between 1320 and 1324. Or the delicate tracery of a tree with curling branches, floral arrangement, and a palm motif in the famous stone jalis in the incomplete mosque of Sidi Sayyid in Ahmedabad in India, built in 1573. The great Mughal sultans elevated funerary architecture to an unprecedented monumental level, potentially as a means of enhancing the image of the sultan as someone akin to the shadow of God on earth, or at least this is what some of their chronicles imply. The first in the line of a spectacular series is the tomb of Humayun, the second great Mughal in Delhi, built by his wife Bega Begum in 1569-1570. Designed by a Persian architect or a bunch of Persian architects, and following in the line of great Ilkhanid and Timurid mausolea, the tomb of Humayun has a Hasht Bihisht or an eight paradise plan, with the cenotaph of the emperor standing on a low dais in the middle of a central domed hall. Light filters through geometrically simple stone jalis on three levels, imbuing the circumambulatory space with a soft, calm, and cool feel. The smaller mausoleum of the Sufi master, Salim Shisti, built by Sultan Akbar, Humayun's son and the greatest of all of Mughal emperors in India, is a true marble of filtered light. Constructed in 1580 or 81 in the court of the Congregational Mosque of Fatehpur Sikri, the new short-lived royal capital of Akbar, the mausoleum was a sign of devotion to this famous Sufi who predicted to Akbar that he will soon have an heir to the throne, and effectively he did. Delicately carved screens surround the jewel-like domed rectangular structure on all sides and give it the aura of crocheted ivory white box. The interior effect is even more exceptional, for projected tracery-like light pattern move across the floor all day long following the movement of the sun around this south-facing tomb. The views, as you can see in here, across the counterjured marble screens to the outside turn the solid red sandstone walls of the surrounding mosque into a mirage-like, shimmering architectural surfaces akin to the effect of the Pontyist paintings of late 19th century France. The Taj Mahal, built by Shah Jahan in memory of his wife Mumtaz Mahal, represent the zenith of the Mamluk architectural tradition at all levels. Poised and harmoniously proportioned, the monument dazzles with its scintillating white profile, infused with a plethora of colored semi-precious stones, incised into its marble surfaces in a technique called by its expressive Italian name, pietra dura, hard stone. Its interior displays a paler shade of white, adorned with the same pietra dura, but takes the filtering of light a step further by adding an octagonal screened parapet around the two cenotaphs of the Sultan and his consort, which is a true tour de force of marble carving. The new naturalism that informs the decoration of the Taj inside and outside manifests itself in the screened panels in the form of interlacing realistic leaves and flowers, some blossoming and some still budding, arranged on a geometric grid of lined up circle. I'm talking, of course, about this. This intentionally delicate rendering of flowery screens enclosing the cenotaph is befitting the image of the beautiful Mumtaz Mahal, who died quite young during delivery and whose bereaved husband decided to immortalize her memory in this sublime monument. The addition of the cenotaph of Shah Jahan, who died 14 years after the completion of the monument, and that's his cenotaph in here, the one on the side that is most probably an afterthought, even though it is infinitely more romantic, and I encourage you to do that, to imagine these two lovers reunited intentionally under this sumptuous dome for eternity. The everyday version of these extravagant marble grills is the turned wood lattice work called Roshan Shanshul Khus, but popularized by its Egyptian name, the Mashrabiya. Used to cover the windows of domestic spaces across the hot and sunny regions in the Islamic world, especially in Egypt, Iraq, and the Hijaz, the Mashrabiya was more than an environmental device to lessen the effect of glaring sunlight or an artistic apparatus to create dynamic geometric patterns. It was essentially a screen to conceal the interior of the house so that women can move freely away from the gaze of men, a contrivance depicted so light-heartedly by the British painter John Frederick Lewis, who lived with his family in Cairo in the 1870s and painted fanciful stories in realistic settings. His models are actually his family members. And of course, actually, the man in the models is always him. Privacy is said to be one of the most valued qualities in Islamic domestic spaces. Hassan Fathi, the most famous Egyptian reviver of vernacular architecture, insisted on the positive role of the Mashrabiya in ensuring that domestic privacy, which he called sakina. He even wrote a short play, The Story of a Mashrabiya, wherein he admiringly extolled privacy, tranquility, and femininity as paramount domestic qualities of the Islamic house. But a photo by the Egyptian artist Susan Hefuna blatantly reminds us that no matter how beautiful the trellis of the Mashrabiya is, it is still a grill that separates women from the outside world, even if it allows them perforated views of it. Inventive modern applications of the Mashrabiya, seen as integral to the rationale of the revival of Islamic architecture, avoid its gendered role and focus instead on its environmental and aesthetic aspects, sometimes to spectacular result, as in the Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris by Jean Nouvel, whose south facade is composed of 240 photosensitive motor-controlled diaphragms that create constantly changing arabesque light patterns. A more recent oeuvre of Jean Nouvel, the Louvre of Abu Dhabi Museum, which opened in November of 2017, surpasses all earlier screening experiments that have distinguished the work of this architect in his Islamic projects particularly. A vast perforated dome hovering over a number of white pavilions floating on the water, the Louvre Abu Dhabi is a singular, contemporary, dynamic, even kinetic masterpiece that updates tradition yet respects its aesthetics. The museum's dispersed pavilions are supposed to recall the organically arrayed structures in a traditional city or in a bazaar. But it is really the effect of the dome that lends this building its magical feel. The mass of white buildings is bathed in an infinite number of uneven spots of light filtered through the dome's layer, which are continuously changing following the movement of the sun. The dome, in fact, establishes Nouvel as a virtuoso of natural light, who, in the process, gives Le Corbusier's dictum, architecture is the masterly, correct, and magnificent play of masses brought together in light, a new lyrical twist, which was probably unforeseeable by the prophet of modern architecture, namely Le Corbusier. Finally, let me go back to the examples of light in the Quran and share with you my favorite verse on the subject. Verse number 17 in Surah Al-Baqarah, or the second surah in the Quran. مثلهم كمثل الذي استوقد نارا فلما أضاءت ما حوله ذهب الله بنورهم وتركهم في ظلمات لا يبصرون. Translation. Their example is that of one who kindled a fire, but when it illuminated what was around him, God took away their light and left them in darkness so they could not see. Traditional interpreters give the tritest reading of this beautiful verse. They see it as moving from the state of weak or opportunistic belief to the foreboding state of denial of God's divinity, analogous to blindness that is characteristic of the non-believers who deceitfully pretend to be otherwise. But the verse is much more phenomenologically attentive than the unimaginative orthodox explanation allows. Fire, i.e. artificial light, is deceptive as an enabler of seeing beyond its immediate surrounding, especially in open terrain. The stronger a fire is, the darker, thus invisible, its distant surrounds become. This is both an empirical observation and a parable about the human limits of knowing. For no matter how reassuring our power to see what is around us, there is still much beyond our comprehension that is hidden from our view by our overconfident yet myopic sight. Undoubtedly, this is a Quranic lesson of everlasting relevance. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question. I mean, you mentioned the word Mamluk once when you misspoke about Mughals, but otherwise you didn't mention the Mamluks at all. What is the meaning of that? Is that did they not use light? Is there something you can tell us about?
Yeah, they were such dark characters. What can I tell you? No, I didn't mention the Mamluks because I didn't want to trot my knowledge in here. Remember, I'm actually trying to speak about the limitation of our knowledge. So I know everything about the Mamluk architecture, and I could have actually spent the whole lecture speaking about how light filters in their domes, but it's not really a topic that they seem to have been interested in. And I don't have an explanation for that, except for the fact that they were using material that didn't lend itself so easily to the possibility of playing with light inside, especially in the domes that we all celebrate in the later Mamluk period, which are the stone-carved domes. They are so beautifully and intricately carved from the outside but the light inside of them doesn't really work as magnificently as it does in, say, the structures that have jalousies in them, or the structures that are using the reflective quality of the glazed tiles as it appears in the Timurid and in the Safavid buildings. But no, actually, I mean, I'm still a firm believer in the superiority of Mamluk architecture.
Well, thank you so much for a very exciting and interesting lecture. And I'm going to revert to my roots as an optical physicist and ask a question that I hate when I get asked. But to say is, do you find that there is any way to say that the treatment of light in Islamic architecture is somehow able to be described in a way that is different than what you see in other kinds of architecture? And like I said, this is maybe an ill-founded question, but I am kind of curious if there's some kind of, I don't want to be too essentialist about this, but this idea that there's some kind of treatment that is more prevalent or distinguishing about Islamic architecture.
Well, you're putting me on the spot because I'm going to have to reveal now my very secular stand in a sense, and I'm not going to give you any sort of like Islamic per se. So, I mean, my feeling is that there is a desire to have lit spaces more than mysteriously lit spaces in Islamic architecture. The other thing that makes it a little bit distinct is that heavy dependence on geometric patterns, which allows that, especially if you go back to the first slide that I put with the title of the lecture, that allows this filtration that has ultimately some sort of a geometric pattern to it as it reflects on the surfaces where it is striking. So if there is anything that is particular about light in Islamic architecture, this is how I feel it is. I wouldn't push any sort of like distinct spiritual meaning. As a matter of fact, I was trying to show at the beginning that there is a continuity in the notion of God as light, that Islam is not inventing, that is actually just carrying it over from earlier religions.
Do you think the lively use of color in much of Islamic architecture is an element of light, that light can be broken down into various colors? I mean, when you showed the Iranian tiles, it's implied, but you didn't.
Absolutely, no, but I mean, and this is exactly what I started saying to Peter in the answer. Is and as a matter of fact, actually, once you start thinking about the kind of colors that are being used, they are the very vivid colors. So their light qualities are definitely something that was on the mind of whoever is using those colors. But again, I would say that the idea is to base the interior in light rather than the opposite. So what I'm trying to say in here is that with very few exception, and I would say mostly in the tombs of Sufi sheikhs, there is an emphasis on the visibility inside more so than on the mystery of how the light is moving inside the space. And perhaps actually that also is another characteristic that is something that is quite interesting when you think about it in Islamic architecture, given the fact that Muslim scholars, up until today, Orthodox Muslim scholars, are against the celebration of death. And it's in the celebration of death that Islamic architecture has reached its highest level of mysterious expression. So perhaps actually that tells us never to follow the theologians.
I'm curious about the social relations of production in these great buildings. Do the architects work with the tile makers and the carvers to try to elicit from them materials that will create these effects, or is there a sort of bricolage in which the architect goes around and looks at the existing material resources available and puts them together in certain ways? How do you see the kinds of...
in the presence of the expert on that question, I can't answer. She's the one who wrote about Sinan and his coterie of workers that were probably always I mean, he was decidedly the master designer in his case. But I'll tell you that in other places in the Islamic world, my reading, remember, we don't have really that much writing about workmen and about people about artists, about architects. We have very little information about them. Sinan is really the major exception in that sense. But my reading of the biographies, and I spent 6 months of my life reading 26,000 biographies of one book that was produced in the 1330, looking for biographies of architects and artists, and I found 4. And this is before the internet, before indexing, before anything. So I had to go through them one by one, looking for words like rassam, naqash, muallim, God knows what. And I wrote an article about them. I can send it to you if you want. But my reading of the situation is that the architect is somewhat in the middle of that decision-making order when it comes to the decoration, especially if the decoration has to do with Quranic verses. It's the person who conceives of where the Quranic verses have to go that has the first decision, and the architect has to accommodate it. So, and what is the writing? And then you have the calligrapher, and the calligrapher in most designed spaces is the one that decides how much room he wants. And you can see the difference between buildings where, similar to the lamp that I showed you, we have buildings that are really funny, where they start carving the verse. This is people with a chisel that are going, and then the word alim has no place, and they don't know what to do with it, so they carve it here. Or they sort of like go up above the word, and they carve the word alim this big, and all the other words are in that size. So we have examples of sort of like spaces that were imposed on them, but when you get to the kind of sort of like balanced and poised architecture that Sinan was producing, seems to me that there was a direct communication between the calligrapher, the chooser of the verses, the architect, and the builders as to how much space do we need for those verses, for those cartouches where we will put the verses. So again, my reading from pre-Ottoman, pre-16th century, this is the area that I know better, is that people in the building business were not important, were socially less important than other people. And I'll explain to you in very briefly. There was an architect for Sultan al-Zahir Baybars, who was one of the most prolific builders in the 13th century. And he has building ranging from Cairo to Jerusalem to Hebron to Gaza to Damascus to Aleppo to Tripoli to to Hama and Homs in Syria. I mean, this guy was just building all over because he was the guy that was he was the guy that stopped the Mongols on the one hand, and he is the one who started the effective role of finishing off the Crusades. So he was very much interested in sort of like leaving a trace of himself. And there was an architect by the name of Ibrahim Abul Ghanaim. And he was his most famous architect, built him palaces in citadels and God knows what, and he has no biography. There's absolutely nothing about him in the written sources. The only reason why we know him is that his grandson became a mosque sermon giver. And in his biography, it says, Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Ibrahim Abul Ghanaim is the grandson of the architect of the Sultan. But the architect of the Sultan doesn't appear in the sources. So he's not celebrated. I don't know if this reflects also on what kind of decisions are being made and who makes them. I would say that as far as we know, pre-Safavid, Mughal, and Ottoman, it was really the person responsible for the financing of the building that was making the major decisions.
As in Renaissance Italy, for example, is then the commissioner described as, in fact, the creator of the monument?
No,
often?
no, there are architects in the business, and we know few architects of gunpowder empire periods, but the decisions about size, about height, about this are probably controlled by the person that appears, at least in the Arabic sources, under the name Shad, which means the supervisor. Architects, we do have names of architects here and there, but again, I mean, similar to this Ibrahim Abul Ghanaim, we really don't know much about them. We start knowing about them when they do something outside of architecture. If they write a book, or if they marry their daughter to an emir, or something like that, they appear. They suddenly appear, and suddenly we know something about them, because when they appear, the author would tell you, and he was, by the way, the architect of such and such building.
And finally, who got to choose the verses?
Who got to what?
To choose the verses.
I think actually people employed in the service of the patrons, because the patrons didn't know their Quran. So the person who is going to choose the verses is someone who is trying to reflect what the patron wants to say about themselves. So I'll give you two examples. The Dome of the Rock, about which I did some work, has all the Christology of the Quran. And we know who chose the verses for that. And he was the Eminence Grise in a caliphate of 4 Umayyad caliphs, starting by the father, who is the guy that built the Dome of the Rock, Abd al-Malik, and then going down until his third son, Suleiman, who ruled. And he was the who ruled for only 2 or 3 years. And he was the one that brought the savior of the Umayyad in Islamic historiography. There's one Umayyad caliph in Islamic historiography who's not considered to be sort of like an apostate or a debauched caliph, and his name is Umar bin Abdul Aziz. And it was this guy, Raja bin Hayaway, who is actually a member of the Kinda tribe from Yemen, born and raised in Baysan in Palestine, and who clearly read more than Arabic and who knew his Quran by heart. He is the one that chose all the verses in the Dome of the Rock, and they are clearly ideological. And this is someone who is actually going after a certain message. And we have been, scholars, generations of scholars have been working on those verses and trying to give them meaning. The second example that I will give you is Zahir Baybars himself. So Zahir Baybars conquers the city of Lod from the Crusades in Palestine. And he rebuilt its towers. And he puts on one of the towers a verse that is not used anywhere else at all. And it's the one book in the Quran, it's the one verse in the Quran that has the word of the book that is ascribed to David as his revealed book. So Zahir Baybars, or whoever is the theologian who's making that decision, wants to make the connection between his patron and David as the conqueror of this place many centuries before. And he brings in the one verse that mentions the book called Az-Zubur, which actually doesn't appear anywhere else except for the Quran. And the interpreters have interpreted either as a book that was revealed to David, or if you want to give it a historic connotation, it's the Psalms of Solomon. But we don't know for sure, because the Quran is extremely enigmatic about that. But in these two cases, there are religious scholars who are out there choosing from the Quran what is the most appropriate for the occasion, for the place, and for the message.
Thank you for the talk, Nasser. I enjoyed your last comment about the limits of knowledge, but I think what I enjoyed the most from your talk was actually the transfer of knowledge from one place to the other, the way you were able to bring us from places that aren't necessarily very easy to connect today. And that was through technology, I guess, being able to design. Especially since you brought up the Louvre Abu Dhabi, I was curious if you might comment on the transfer of knowledge in terms of what, as we put in brackets, Islamic architecture since, let's say, the 1980s. Can you say something about how knowledge of what connotes Islamic architecture has maybe taken a different route?
You and Peter today are intent on putting me on the spot. This is really a put on the spot question, but I'll try to answer it without alienating anyone. Especially that I'm responsible for a program that teaches Islamic architecture. So, if we go back to history and what Islamic architecture is, Islamic architecture is not Islamic in a religious sense of the word, and therefore contemporary Islamic architecture needs not be Islamic in a religious sense of the word. So I am not interested in sort of like the argument that says how come that now Islamic architecture is built by non-Muslims? I actually had alienated already the one and only Muslim lord in the House of Lords in England when I had no idea who the guy was. And he asked me a question after a lecture in London, and I answered him by saying, you know, it doesn't really matter what the religion of the architect is if they are producing the proper architecture for the context in which this architecture is being produced. And I gave him the example of the Mosque of Ibn Tulun in Cairo, which is decidedly one of the most serene mosques, and a mosque that has been used by so many people as a model. And we know for a fact that its architect was Christian. And this is an unusual sort of like knowledge in here, because usually we don't know who these people are. And that's because of a very specific story about that architect that appears in the sources. So that's one side of my answer. The second, I was saying that there is a certain rationality that has been projected or brought into play in looking at the contemporary revival of Islamic architecture. I mentioned the example of Hassan Fathi, but there are many other examples. And you have now generations of architects, we are now in the second or the third generation, that believe mostly in the environmental, technological, and perhaps actually spiritual attributes of the architecture that they are building. I was showing that in many instances, I mean, especially in the case of the trellises or of the screens, that there is a gendered use of architecture that needs to be put on the surface if we are going to celebrate the functionality of these mushrabiyas as light filters or as passive energy savers. So a point of criticism, if you want, is that very positivist approach to a heritage of Islamic architecture on the one hand. The other is a very spiritual or a very exclusive that says, this is our architecture. The spiritual, actually, I should leave it out. Because first of all, I don't understand it that well. But second, there is a whole tradition that needs to be respected and perhaps highlighted of how a certain trend in thinking about Islamic architecture from around 1880 down to the present has developed a sophist approach to Islamic architecture, at least to reading Islamic architecture, if not to building it. The few who have claim that they are responding to that. I'll give you one example. Abdul Wahid al-Wakil of Egypt, for example, have really failed to engage that depth of thought about an Islamic architecture that is transcendental. And I think it is impossible really to translate it. I mean, you have to sort of like force read it as such. So I'm speaking about three, if you want, trends or three strands in contemporary Islamic architecture. One is the rationalist or the rationalizing, the other is the exclusive historicist, and the third is the transcendental. And all three of them are the result of European fascination with Islamic architecture.
Well, thanks very much, Nasser, and wonderful pair of lectures. And I'm left with this kind of dual quality of the architecture being primarily aiming to bathe interiors with light, and yet at the same time, this question about the limits of knowledge and the more qualities of darker spaces in Sufi shrines and so on. And it leads me a little bit to ask about whether you think that shade was a dimension of design itself. In some of your talk, you were concentrating on the things that were illuminated. But were there also places designed by shade? It comes to mind a little bit because in Mughal painting, we have almost no representations of shade in painting. I'm curious as whether shadow and shade, as perhaps one would find in pavilion architecture, very widely open to light, except for what might be shaded as kind of part of the scope of what you're thinking about. Is the shade an aspect of design as well? Thoughts on that?
One would hope so. I mean, I'm not so sure, actually, the shade was an aspect of design in what, I mean, unless we are speaking about the creation of interior spaces or the creation of porticos around the court of the mosque, which ultimately become extremely sort of like conventional, and people keep on repeating them over and over. But once we get into the later period of Islamic architecture, we do realize that there is a little bit of a distinction as sort of like a prototype is moving from one place to the other. There are environmental modifications that are being introduced depending on the region. Anatolia is the great example of sort of like closing off of the courtyard in colder climates, and realizing that courtyards don't work. But then once we get into sort of like the imperial Ottoman mosque, you have courtyards back again. So when you move through the 12th, 13th century Anatolian architecture, you see examples where the closing off of the courtyard is going apace. But I'm actually trying to think very hard as to, I mean, of course, there are elements a little bit of shading here and there, but I mean, it's intriguing that you bring in the notion that there is no shade in Islamic painting. I don't want to read into that anything about what architect. I mean, I'm sure actually there are people who have already written about that. Again, I'm sort of like trying to resist that attempt at reading something that is fundamentally Islamic about the architecture. And that's why I am constantly going back in my answers to saying that this is just a tradition of architecture that is extremely alive and in connection with all other traditions and even absorbing them. So, I mean, I mentioned the Christian architect, but as you know, I mean, in India, up until the arrival of the Mughal, I suspect that all the architects were Hindu. But with the arrival of the Mughal, you started having the influx of Persian architects coming in to work for the Mughal. So I don't think we've had a question in the pre-modern Islamic architecture as to what tradition are you in touch with. And my interpretation of the rejection of Western influence today as un-Islamic is the sense of cultural and civilizational defeat, not the fact that we don't want that, but because we feel certain inferiority that we need to reject it as such. I mean, this is how I read the use of non-Islamic motifs, non-Islamic types, non-Muslim architects in the past with absolutely no compunction. And in the present, you have patrons who are reacting and saying, how come? And it seems to me that this has to do with how comfortable a culture is with its position. I mean, America is a very good example of like, anything goes, it doesn't matter. Everything can become American. I don't know if I answered this question, but I don't have an answer.
Thank you. I was wondering about astronomy and considerations of light. It comes to mind other examples where perhaps on a certain day there would have been an alignment. And I was wondering if there are examples of that in Islamic architecture.
I don't know. I can speculate, but I don't know really. The examples that I know are early, and they are very much in the Greek tradition, where there is a direct reference, if you want, to the Dome of Heaven or to the arrangement of the stars. The most famous example is the dome of the Hammam of the famous Umayyad palace in Jordan, Qusayr Amra, which has actually the Ptolemaic, the one of two examples that we have of a Ptolemaic Dome of Heaven with the arrangement of the constellation in it. The other one comes from a Ptolemaic, one is Ptolemy and the other is the Ptolemaic dynasty. They're more or less the same, the same name, but one is the geographer that I'm talking about who worked under the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. And we have a Ptolemaic temple from Egypt in Dandara that had also the same representation. And it's exactly the same. This is the interesting thing about it. One is sort of like 1st or 2nd century BC, the other is 7th century AD or 8th century AD. And it's the exact same arrangement of constellation that appears in a two-dome. They're painted. But I don't know how astronomy otherwise would have influenced the use of light, except for the fact that it might have been a way where they wanted to, if you want, measure the time. The most important function of an astronomer / mathematician in Islamic tradition is to decide on the time of prayer. And for that, there was a very elaborate work on the idea of reading the time through the shadow of some stick somewhere or some element. And we have plenty of such examples. But I'm actually trying to think about what other examples would be there. The other one, but again, my own very limited examination, I should say, is the malqaf, or the wind catcher, and the orientation of the wind catcher towards the desired winds. And that this has to do also with some sort of environmental reading. And there is one or two scholars who have actually worked tremendously on that subject. We don't have earlier examples of malqafs than 19th century, so we don't know how they functioned before, but we know them from the literature, and we know their names, and they appear in the 1001 Night. You have like a thief that comes into the house by jumping through the wind catcher because it's an open space. But the orientation of the wind catcher was something that also required a little bit of, because astronomers, mathematicians were somewhat overlapping, but otherwise, I don't have any other example really.
Do you know anything about the builders or designers of the mosques in the Umayyad city of Madinat al-Zahra? Is there any knowledge about that?
No,
No,
not at all.
there's nothing.
Do you?
No.
I mean, it would be interesting to know, but no, I don't know anything, even though I supervised the PhD dissertation on it.
Thanks.
Thank you. I would just want to echo all the other thank yous for a great talk. I'm ashamed to admit that I am maybe an example of Western fascination with Islamic architecture, but I'm going to own that and just say I see in the examples of contemporary Islamic architecture lots of things that to me evoke the Jali or maybe the Mashrabiya. But is Muqarnas dead? Where is it still alive? Is it being used in contemporary architecture?
I mean, the most famous modern example is the Islamic Art Museum in Doha, in Qatar. IMP has used the Muqarnas squinch to support his rotating dome, which actually is not a dome, really. It's a rotating square, and sort of like a little dome is imposed on top of it. But yeah, no, I mean, Muqarnas is alive and kicking. Yeah.
Well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank Professor Nasser Rabbat for two extraordinary talks, and hopefully you'll come back in the future and talk to us again. Thank you very much.
Down the road, you know.